You know how sometimes it don't take a whole army to win a war. It don't take big guns or loud voices to change history. Sometimes all it takes is one word to break the silence, one word to shake the foundations of power. And in this moment, that one word came from Dr. S. Jaishankar. Not screaming, not fighting, but with the kind of quiet confidence that only comes when you know your nation has grown too strong to be pushed around. Now, let me tell you something, because this ain't just about diplomacy or politics. This is about dignity, real dignity. You see, when the Western world looked at the Russia-Ukraine situation, they thought they had everyone figured out. They assumed they could snap their fingers, point at countries, and say, you're with us or against us, like some kind of global sheriff. They expected the whole world to fall in line, follow orders, and ask how high when told to jump. But they made one serious mistake. They forgot that some countries had grown up while they weren't watching. Countries like India that don't take orders anymore, don't beg for approval, don't need permission to make their own choices. Because when the West tried to corner India about buying Russian energy, when they tried to shame India for thinking about its own people first, when they thought they could guilt-trip India into economic suicide, they expected maybe some explaining, maybe some backing down. But what they got, what caught them completely off guard, was Jaishankar cool, calm, and sharp as a blade. When America and Europe tried to paint India as selfish for buying cheap oil during tough times, when they tried to make India the villain for refusing to hurt its own economy, the West thought they'd get apologies, maybe promises to change. Instead, Jaishankar stood up and said one word that changed everything. That word was survival. Just one word. But packed in that word was a whole philosophy that the rich nations didn't want to hear, because survival ain't just about staying alive. It's about refusing to let others decide your fate. It's about putting your people first when everyone else wants to put them last. It's about saying no to powerful bullies who think they can make you choose between being moral and being smart. The Western leaders, for all their experience running the world, weren't ready for that kind of honesty. Because here was India, a country they still saw as their junior partner, now saying, your problems ain't automatically our problems. And coming from Jaishankar, that wasn't just policy. That was a declaration of independence from Western guilt trips and pressure tactics. Let's be honest, the European Union knew how to make other countries feel guilty. They knew how to use moral language to hide their own interests. They knew how to make smaller nations sacrifice for bigger ones. But they didn't count on something important about today's Indian leadership. They don't get embarrassed by Western lectures anymore. They're practical, they're focused, and Jaishankar, he's like the steady hand on the wheel while storms rage all around. See, when Europe demanded India stop buying Russian oil and join their economic war, India didn't panic or rush to please them. India looked at its own needs first. And Jaishankar made it plain as day that India's first job is taking care of Indian families, not making European politicians feel good about themselves. That one word, survival, started something that nobody in Brussels or Washington expected. Because suddenly, India wasn't just defending its choices, it was questioning theirs, not with anger or insults, but with simple facts that hurt more than any attack. Jaishankar didn't lose his cool. He didn't need to. He just started asking uncomfortable questions that made the West squirm. You think that was all? Think again. Because what happened next was India turning the tables completely. When European leaders tried to lecture India about morality and values, Jaishankar didn't back down or apologize. He reminded them that Europe was still buying Russian gas every single day while telling India not to buy Russian oil. That wasn't just pointing out facts. That was exposing the whole game. When the West tried to use the democracy card, trying to make India feel bad about not supporting Ukraine enough, Jaishankar cut through that noise too. He said the world's biggest democracy knows how to think for itself. Thank you very much. That wasn't arrogance. That was confidence. The kind that comes from knowing you don't need anyone else's approval to make good decisions. This was the turning point when everything shifted. India wasn't just saying, leave us alone anymore. It was saying, who made you the boss of everyone? And that question hit the Western world like cold water to the face. Because for decades, they'd gotten comfortable being the teachers, the rule makers, the ones who decided what was right and wrong for everybody else. But here was India, steady as a rock, asking, why should your values matter more than our survival? That simple question broke apart years of Western moral authority. Because when you really think about it, what gives rich countries the right to tell poor countries to stay poor for moral reasons? What makes European comfort more important than Indian families having electricity? Let's talk about energy for a second. The West went all out trying to make India give up cheap Russian oil. They offered alternatives that cost 3 times more. They made threats about being on the wrong side of history. They tried everything they could think of. But India, under Jaishankar, was playing chess while they were still playing checkers. While the West worried about looking tough against Russia, India worried about keeping its factories running and its people warm. While Brussels talked about sanctions and punishment, New Delhi talked about survival and common sense. And when it came down to it, Jaishankar made the choice that any smart leader would make. He chose his people over other people's politics. The defense situation shows the same pattern. For years, Western countries used military equipment like treats for good dogs. Behave well, get some weapons, act up, get cut off. They thought they could play the same game with India. But Jaishankar flipped that whole script. He made it clear India would buy weapons that made India safer, not weapons that made the West feel better about India. India started building its own missiles, designing its own fighters, creating its own defense industry. That's when NATO started getting nervous, because India wasn't just buying from Russia to be difficult. India was buying from everyone, learning from everyone, and becoming independent from everyone. The kind of independence that makes other countries worried because they can't control it. Now let's look at China. The West loved bringing up China whenever they wanted to scare India into their camp. Join us against China, they said. Help us contain Beijing, they promised. Pick our side in the new Cold War, they demanded. But Jaishankar had different ideas about that whole setup. He made it clear that India doesn't need Western permission to handle China. India's been dealing with China since before America was even a country. They'll keep dealing with China long after the West figures out what it really wants. That message wasn't emotional or angry. It was just reality served cold and simple. The Ukraine crisis really showed how different India's thinking had become. Western leaders wanted India to pick sides, wave flags, make speeches about good versus evil. But India looked at Ukraine and saw what happens when big powers use small countries as chess pieces. They saw what happens when you trust the wrong promises from the wrong people. So India chose something that made the West even angrier than picking Russia's side. India chose itself. Not because they couldn't choose sides, but because they were smart enough to see that other people's fights don't have to become your fights. Jaishankar didn't apologize for that choice or make long explanations. He just said India believes in peace, not picking teams. That neutrality hit the West harder than support for Russia would have, because neutrality from India meant we're strong enough to make our own path, and that scared Western leaders more than any enemy could. They were used to countries that needed guidance, needed protection, needed the West to tell them how to think. But here was India thinking for itself, and that was terrifying. You want to know why that word survival cut so deep? Because it was honest, completely, totally, undeniably honest. It stripped away all the fancy language about values and democracy and got right to the heart of things. Countries exist to take care of their people, not to make other countries feel good about their choices. That honesty changed the whole conversation, not just between India and the West, but between India and the rest of the world, because other countries were watching closely. They saw how India stood up to the biggest powers without starting a fight. They saw how you could say no without being nasty. They saw how respect works when you respect yourself first. After that moment, world leaders started approaching India differently. You could see it in their body language, hear it in their words, feel it in the way they made their requests instead of demands. They understood that India wasn't at the table begging for scraps. India was there as an equal partner, ready to walk away if treated otherwise. The West learned something important that day. They learned that the world had changed while they were busy running it. They learned that countries like India had gotten stronger, smarter, more confident. They learned that you can't guilt-trip a nation that knows its own worth. And most importantly, they learned that moral lectures don't work on people who can see through them. Jaishankar didn't need to raise his voice or make threats. He just needed to speak truth in a world full of lies, and the truth was powerful enough to shake foundations. Because truth is the one weapon that no amount of money or military power can stop. Truth cuts through propaganda, cuts through guilt trips, cuts through manipulation, and gets to what really matters. That's why this moment became so important, not because of what India did, but because of what it meant. It meant that the age of Western countries telling everyone else what to do was ending, not because someone beat them in war, but because countries like India had grown too proud to be lectured anymore. The whole world took notice. From Africa to Asia, from Latin America to the Middle East, countries started thinking maybe they didn't have to choose Western sides either. Maybe they could stand up for their own interests too. Maybe they could tell the truth without saying sorry for it. Maybe they could be independent without being alone. And the West had to face something they didn't want to accept. That their time as the world's moral police was over, not because they lost their power, but because other countries had found theirs. The age of do what we say was ending. The age of let's talk as equals was starting. Other nations started following India's example. They started asking their own hard questions. If India can say no to Western pressure, why can't we? If India can put its people first, why can't we? If India can make its own choices, why are we still asking permission? That's how one word from one man started a whole movement. The energy market shifted. Countries that used to ask the West for permission to buy oil started making their own deals. The weapons market changed. Nations that used to depend on Western arms started looking for alternatives. The whole system of Western control started cracking because India had shown there was another way. What made it even more powerful was how calm Jaishankar stayed through it all. He didn't gloat or celebrate or rub anyone's face in it. He just kept doing what was best for India, kept speaking truth when others spoke politics, kept putting his country's needs above other countries' feelings. That kind of steady leadership is rare in today's world. The message was clear to everyone watching. You don't have to be loud to be strong. You don't have to be mean to be firm. You don't have to apologize for putting your people first. You just have to know who you are and what you stand for, and then stand there no matter who tries to move you. But let's talk about what happened next, because that one word survival didn't just end the conversation. It started a whole new chapter in how the world works. See, when other developing nations saw India stand up like that, they started getting ideas. They started thinking maybe they don't have to choose between feeding their families and making rich countries happy. Maybe they can say no too. Brazil looked at what India did and started making its own moves. South Africa took notes. Indonesia paid attention. Countries that had spent decades being told what to do suddenly realized they had options. That's the thing about leadership. Real leadership don't just change your own situation. It shows others what's possible. The trade numbers tell the whole story. After Jaishankar made it clear India would buy energy wherever it made sense, other countries started doing the same. The West's plan to isolate Russia through economic pressure started falling apart because too many countries decided their people mattered more than Western politics. That wasn't rebellion. That was common sense. Let me tell you about the meetings that came after. The atmosphere was completely different. Western leaders couldn't just walk in and expect everyone to nod along anymore. They had to actually explain their positions, actually make cases instead of just giving orders. Because India had shown that you could disagree without being disrespectful. Jaishankar sat in those meetings like a man who knew exactly where he stood. When Western delegates tried to push through statements that would hurt developing countries, he didn't get loud or dramatic. He just asked simple questions. Who benefits from this? Why should poor countries pay for rich countries' politics? Those questions cut deeper than any speech. The climate talks showed the same pattern. For years, Western countries had been telling developing nations to slow down their growth, use less energy, stay poor to save the planet, but they never wanted to talk about who had caused the mess in the first place. When Jaishankar spoke about climate justice, he didn't just talk about fairness, he talked about survival. He pointed out that telling poor countries not to develop was like telling hungry people not to eat. He made it clear. Or that India would grow its economy, lift its people out of poverty, and build a better future for its children. And if the West didn't like it, they could offer real help instead of empty lectures. The technology discussions got interesting too. Western companies had gotten used to selling old tech to developing countries at high prices while keeping the good stuff for themselves. But after India's energy independence move, other countries started demanding better deals. They wanted fair prices, real partnerships, instead of charity handouts. Jaishankar didn't need to make threats about this. He just made it clear that India had options. China was offering tech transfers. Russia was sharing knowledge. European companies could either compete on fair terms or watch their market share disappear. That kind of quiet leverage is more powerful than any loud demand. That's the power of one word said at the right time by the right person. That's the power of truth spoken without fear. That's the power of a country that finally understands its own strength and ain't scared to use it. Jaishankar didn't just speak for India that day. He spoke for every nation tired of being told what to do by people who think they know better. Because you can't intimidate a country that knows its worth. You can't shake a nation that's found its backbone. And you definitely can't control people who've decided they're done being controlled. Jaishankar didn't just say one word. He started a revolution where countries choose survival over submission, truth over politeness, and independence over approval. That's what it took. One word, said with conviction, backed by strength, supported by 1 billion people who were ready to stand behind their leader. When everything settled and the noise died down, the world was different. Not because of what happened, but because of what it represented. The time of giants bullying everyone else was ending. The time of equals talking to equals had begun.